Welcome, everyone, to this special online and on-the-road event with the New York Philharmonic, 1943 to 1970. This is an international video web chat celebrating the online release of more of the New York Philharmonic's archives and exploring New York Philharmonic foreign tours in the middle decades of the 20th century. I'm Jeff Spurgeon. I work at WQXR, the classical radio station in New York City, and I'm here in our studios. It's a great pleasure for me to moderate today's conversation, which will involve people from all around the world, quite literally. I'll introduce our panelists very quickly. We'll have a few opening remarks from the New York Philharmonic Archivist, and then we'll get into our discussion today. We hope to have time for questions at the end. If you have some, we have a Facebook page, and you can also send them via Twitter to hashtag NYP History. NYP History is the Twitter hashtag to use for questions if you'd like to be a part of this discussion as well. Our panelists are lined up by time zone. We'll start in Eastern North America, where it's a little after 10:30 in the morning. We're joined by Michael Beckerman. He is the chair of music at New York University. He's logged in from his office just off Washington Square Park in Manhattan. Barbara Haws is archivist and historian of the New York Philharmonic. She's speaking to us from the Leon Levy Foundation, also here in New York City, the home of the New York Philharmonic Archives. Matthew Mugmon is a musicologist. He's at Payne Hall at Harvard in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In Western Europe, we'll jump the ocean very quickly. It's the middle of the afternoon there. Assistant Professor of Sociology at Columbia University, Shamus is with us. He's logged on from Reed Hall, Columbia's Reed Hall in Paris. Also with us is Wolfgang Rathert. He's a musicology professor at Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich, and he is logged on from his home office in Berlin today. Continuing east, we welcome Olga Manulkina. She is associate professor at St. Petersburg State Conservatory, logged in from the Bard Smolny campus there, where it's 6:30 in the evening. And finally, in Tokyo, where it's practically tomorrow, we're joined by composer and professor of music at Ochanomizu University, Ochanomizu University, Joe Kondo. First to New York Philharmonic archivist and historian Barbara Haws. Barbara, we're all here. Tell us why.
Well, around 3 years ago, we started a project with the generous help of the Leon Levy Foundation to digitize the remarkable archives of the New York Philharmonic. The goal was to photograph, digitize, make available 1.3 million pages in 3 years, and we're now nearly finished with that phase of the project. A year ago, we made our first launch of material public, around 1,200 scores of Leonard Bernstein and Andrei Kostelanetz programs, every printed program between the time period of 1943 and 1970. Since that time, we've had over 50,000 unique visitors to the digital archives. We've had some extraordinary power users who in the last year, over 1,200 people have been here. No, I guess it's 1,200 people have been here over 200 times, and there are 124 countries represented in by visiting the digital archives. Today, we are making another launch of a major amount of material, basically photographs, about 12,000 photographs from the time period of 1943 to 1970, and 1,200 files, business files, that relate to board of directors minutes, operations, tour material, different kinds of program magazines. But again, the idea is to be comprehensive, and we are making all of that available today for the first time. And so to celebrate this, or to market and to see what we could learn from it, we thought it would be terrific to bring together a group of scholars from around the world to see how this maybe makes an impact on their thinking, their studies. And since most of the material is related right now, the photographs and a lot of the business files, to the touring in the 50s and the 60s, that's generally our idea of talking. What we'd like to talk about today is the Philharmonic Leonard Bernstein's tours during the 50s and 60s.
All right, Barbara, thank you. So set the stage for us a little bit and give us a 1 minute or so version of what was going on in the 1950s and 1960s, so we have a little bit more context for the discussion.
Well, in the sort of minute and a half version, okay, in 1950 and 60 or 50s, the world was emerging from war. The U.S. was in ascendancy. There was interest by the American government to export our culture. And in particular, it was used in the fight against communism. The Philharmonic was extremely useful in this, and Leonard Bernstein, as a charismatic and a very handsome leader who also spoke English, if you think about it, it was a very remarkable thing for a music director of the New York Philharmonic to have English as a native language, was enlisted to do this. The United States government, in specifically the USIA, the United States Information Agency, hosted two of the major tours, one 1958 to South America, and the next one 1959 to Europe, the Soviet Union, and Middle East. The irony of this, it's just a small point, but really the irony of this, to me at least, is that in 1959, the State Department has enlisted Leonard Bernstein to be the leader and the mouthpiece of all that's good in America. At the same time, when J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI have him under investigation for un-American activities. The Ford Motor Company gets involved in 1960 with sponsoring a tour to West Berlin, and again, the State Department endorses it as being important to their mission in Europe. And then in 1961, the Philharmonic makes its very first trip to Asia, to Japan. In all of this, Leonard Bernstein is making his own statements. He is using music the way he wants to. And even though maybe the United States government had an idea of what they wanted to accomplish, Leonard Bernstein's mission was of peace, humanity, showing the commonality of people, how we just got along. And all of this was done through music. Got it.
All right, let's turn then to our panel and talk about this time and what these archives bring to mind. Olga Manulkina in St. Petersburg. In America, Olga, we think that this was quite radical for Leonard Bernstein to talk about how the Russians and the Americans were very much alike. This was during the height of the Cold War. We focus on his programming of Copland and Shostakovich, but also he conducted Stravinsky at that time. What was the reaction to that? Stravinsky being programmed by the New York Philharmonic in Russia, in concerts by the New York Philharmonic during the Cold War.
First of all, the programming Copland and Shostakovich and comparing them and the Russian and American peoples was radical, because for the 10 years before, everything American was forbidden. And American music and musicians came as a main targets in the campaigns against formalism and cosmopolitanism. In the film made in Moscow on September 11th, when Bernstein conducts American anthem, we see old women shaking her head disapprovingly. American anthem in Moscow Conservatory, how dangerous, what consequences could be. And unfortunately, her fears were absolutely justified, while the younger woman next to her is beaming with joy. And unfortunately, her hopes for the freedom wouldn't come true, because the war would finish very soon. So most of the American music shouldn't have been performed and studied, but some composers were considered to be friends, and Copland was among them. So he visited Soviet Union next year in 1960. That's why, while Bernstein's talk about similarities in American and Russian peoples and music was radical, the performance of music by Copland was not. But the most radical concert concerning programming was on 25th of August, when the program scheduled Stravinsky. And that was incredible breakthrough, because Russian immigrant composers were also left behind the Iron Curtain. And the greatest composer of the 20th century, a genius and a Russian, was considered to be persona non grata in his motherland, his music not being performed. The only chance to hear The Rite of Spring, for example, for many decades, came in 1957 on the recordings by Igor Markevich that got to the Soviet Union during the Festival of Youth and Students in 1957. We might say that with Bernstein playing Stravinsky, conducted Stravinsky, the historical circle was complete, because the score written by the Russian, by St. Petersburg composer Igor Stravinsky, premiered in Paris, which got to USA in the 20s, was brought back to Russia by first American-born conductor, the son of Russian Jewish immigrants. And everything here was as incredible as could be, just unbelievable for the Soviet audience, I mean. But more than this, Bernstein didn't only play Stravinsky, he talked about it. And I first learned about his words from my older colleague, Joseph Raiskin, who managed to get both the Moscow and Leningrad concerts. And from him I know how shocking it was. What he heard, apparently in translation, was, here you had some kind of revolution, said Bernstein, but the real revolution was several years before, because the music never was the same since then, after Rite of Spring. The very idea of comparing just anything to great October socialist revolution was a crime. It was, and comparing the work by composer and immigrant was a slap in the face to the Soviet officials. So no wonder that this concert got the only negative review. Otherwise, the review was very favorable. And the critic and the party official, Alexander Medvedev, didn't dare to quote Bernstein words. He just mentioned that Bernstein called the Rite of Spring revolutionary work and didn't explain why. And the critic continued with outraged lie. He wrote that this music by Stravinsky was very often played and studied, and if Maestro would come down from the stage, he would see the scores in the audience. That's in the moment when you couldn't get Stravinsky scores in the Conservatory libraries, or could get only with special permission and not all of them. So actually, when this critic wrote that it was kind of the show, Leonard Bernstein is lifting an iron curtain in music, that was the case, only that wasn't the show, that was the real. We might say that on the 25th of August, Leonard Bernstein and New York Philharmonic made their own revolution, bringing Stravinsky back to Russia. And so in the coming years, his music was again got under censorship and wasn't played very often. Several hundreds listeners kept the Bernstein performance in their hearts and minds. And apparently these concerts helped to pave the way for first and last Stravinsky visit to his motherland in 3 years in 1962.
Thank you, Professor Olga Manulkina in St. Petersburg. Wolfgang Rathert, Bernstein and the New York Philharmonic Orchestra's first performance in Berlin, 1959. That was the debut of a brilliant musical representative from the United States, first time that Bernstein had been there. It was also part of a cultural and a political mission. In his introduction to the Berlin audience in 1960, Bernstein emphasized the importance of cultural exchange as a peace-building activity. And again, the Cold War was running strong. Is there a deeper sort of symbolic and strategic meaning behind that very obviously, very carefully arranged 1959 to 1960 program that he was conducting in Berlin and Russia?
Yes, I think so, that Bernstein indeed very carefully arranged his programs, although they were, of course, a part of a programming that we can see also in the 1950s. But there was one, as I think, a dramatic change insofar as he put American works on the program, and he did it more than any other conductor, non-American born conductors before him. I think Howard Janet mentioned that he raised the amount of American works up to 30% in his own programs. And so I think he wanted to show that American music had become adult, that the American symphonic music had to be taken serious. And this was, I think, one of the cultural messages he sent to Berlin and to the West German audience. And on the Russian programs, Olga just had talked to us, but I think that's also he continued this programming to Russia, to the Iron Curtain, or behind the Iron Curtain, in order to show that music could be a cultural task that spanned around the world. It's interesting that there is a history behind this Berlin concert that leads back to Munich, where I'm teaching, because Bernstein at first appeared in 1948 in a Munich program. He conducted the Bavarian State Orchestra. He was invited by Omgus to conduct the program, and the Bavarian orchestra was enthusiastic about him, although they were on a food strike before. And there he conducted also a program that seems to me the model for his later programs. That is, he conducted Schumann's Second Symphony, Piston's Third Symphony, and the Ravel Concerto, playing himself the piano. So even there, he tried to bring together American and European music as a part of a cultural mission. And Amy Beale, the American musicologist, she had investigated the influence of the Cold War on music history after on the European-American relationships, and she said that, and I would like to quote her, that Bernstein embodied a smart, muscular American quality who was appropriate for the Omgus purposes. He was scheduled to conduct the Bavarian State Orchestra, and he paved the way for other American musicians, conductors, and orchestras who toured Germany during the years of the military occupation and afterwards. Embracing the role of a musical messenger of the free world, Bernstein joined a diverse gamut of tools, both human and institutional, for rebuilding German culture. And that's, I think, is the idea behind the both Berlin programs. The 1959 the performance was a sensation, and in 1960 also the American the American broadcast came to Berlin to film the second concert of the New York Philharmonic. To add, in 1960 he came to Berlin and interrupted a concert tour through the States, and they were paid by the Ford Motor Company. I think they paid $150,000, which was a great amount of money at that time, to sponsor and to organize the trip to Berlin. And it is interesting at the end to see that to look at the reviews. They were both German, but more interesting American reviews. One of them by Everett Helm, who was an Omgus music officer in the after 1945. Everett Helm said it was not only a musical but a political triumph that Bernstein caused in the Berlin Festwochen program.
Professor, you had, I think, some images that we could show. Did we skip over those, or would you like to present them?
So this program, starting with Berlioz, Carnival Roman.
Yeah, that's the one we have up. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, and a typical Bernstein start, I would say, in Bernstein programming, because he used it also in Russia, which was also a kind of irony. And then the G major concerto by Mozart, demonstrating that he was capable and an authority also in German Austrian classical music. After the break, Ives unanswered question, I would say a sort of symbolic piece for Bernstein, and later he labeled his Harvard lectures music the unanswered question after this piece. And then Piston's Concerto for Orchestra. Piston was one of the teachers at Harvard, and at the end, La Valse, again, international French piece, was a piece of showcase. And I've chosen the last program that Bernstein conducted in 1968 in Berlin. I don't know if we can show it.
Yeah.
Yes, we have it up.
Great. And that's interesting because in the program book, he's said that he's a retiring director of the New York Philharmonic. At that time, it was clear that he would Philharmonic, and he shows us for this program Mahler Fifth Symphony, which was, I think, a hardcore piece for him. I use a pun. A piece which he felt very close to, and it's a wonderful score in the archives which show his remarks to this piece. And then after the pause again, or before the Roy Harris Third Symphony. In the last quote from 1915, from a 1960 interview. Oh, I hope I find it. Oops. Where he's asked about the Third Symphony, and he says this symphony was the beginning of an era in which the symphony became an American product, and within the time of 60 minutes with piston used for this piece, it was no longer than 60 minutes, he has managed to compress the equivalent of a novel, which is what a symphony should be in music, in a very terse and compelling cogent way. So I think that this program, the last program in Berlin in 1968, was also a very symbolic piece of concert.
All right, thank you very much. Professor Wolfgang Rathert, who's speaking to us from his office in Berlin. Let's turn now to Matthew Muckman. Matthew, you're a specialist in the performance of Mahler. Mahler is a special field of your study. It's one of Leonard Bernstein's most important legacies at the New York Philharmonic was the role he played in popularizing the Mahler symphonies and just getting their impact into the heads of music lovers around the world. How did Bernstein's touring with the New York Philharmonic connect to that Mahler legacy?
Thanks. Well, we heard a little bit just now. I mean, the 1968 tour was where we heard that Bernstein performed Mahler's Fifth Symphony. In fact, Bernstein had been performing Mahler with the New York Philharmonic since 1960. So really, this tour that we just heard about was really the culmination of a decade of exploring Mahler symphonies, which Bernstein hadn't performed much of until he joined the New York Philharmonic. And that 1968 tour, which was indeed was before his final season at the New York Philharmonic, he performed it in Israel and in Berlin, as we heard, and also in Vienna. And while I'm talking, if we could look at the first document, it's not a big deal if we can't get it up, but there's an image of Bernstein in the Concerthaus in Vienna. So there are a lot of important things about Bernstein performing Mahler's Fifth on this 1968 tour that I think connect to that legacy as a Mahler conductor. I'll just touch on a few of them. It was really, as I said, the culmination of a decade and kind of a pivot point too. He had been developing this, just to focus on Vienna for a second, he'd been developing this relationship with Vienna as a conductor. And he was really a huge success there. He started to perform Mahler's music there in the mid-60s, not with the New York Philharmonic, but at this tour he was bringing the Philharmonic to Vienna, which interestingly enough was, the Philharmonic was also the orchestra that Mahler himself conducted in New York. And along with everything else that Bernstein seemed to do in Vienna, this was a big success. And one of the documents, we don't have an image of it here, but the translations of reviews in the Viennese press, and one of the reviews at the end of the year, end of 1968, calls this performance of Mahler's Fifth the most unforgettable concert of the year in Vienna. And remember, this is Vienna. There's a lot of music happening there. A lot of things could probably fit that bill, but we had Bernstein's performance of Mahler's Fifth. The other thing that I think is interesting, well, there are a lot, but another thing I could talk about right now is that Bernstein had just finished performing and recording a cycle of Mahler symphonies with the New York Philharmonic, and that was released the year before this tour in 1967. In the second document, and if we can get that up, it's an advertisement from one of the New York Philharmonic's programs of this box set that was released. And just that year of the tour, when Robert F. Kennedy's funeral took place, Bernstein conducted a movement from Mahler's Fifth at at his funeral with members of the New York Philharmonic. So there are a lot of things coming together at this tour, but I think that when we see Mahler moving on from the Philharmonic and taking on Vienna as a real home for his performances of Mahler's symphonies in the 1970s with the Vienna Philharmonic, we can really see that tour as a pivot point in his career.
What about Bernstein's conducting of Mahler in Israel? On the 1968 tour, I took the Fifth Symphony there. What did that speak to about Bernstein's relationship with Israel and his identity as a Jewish musician? Mahler also Jewish, so there's a lot there, I think.
Yeah, so a big reason that Bernstein apparently felt this deep connection to Mahler's music was the sense that he closely identified with Mahler as a musician. Both had to balance composing and conducting, both led the New York Philharmonic at some point. And now Bernstein was developing this presence in Vienna, which is the city where Mahler had a major part of his career. And both were Jewish, like you said. And for Bernstein, Mahler's Jewish identity was really a big part of his view of Mahler's significance. And on that tour, as you said, Israel was one of the stops in which he performed Mahler's Fifth. And there's a program, if we can look at the fourth document from one of those performances. Just the year before, Bernstein, in keeping with the fact that he had this long relationship performing in Israel that went back to the late 40s and performing Mahler in Israel. The year before, in 1967, he conducted the Israel Philharmonic in some movements from Mahler's Second, which is known as the Resurrection Symphony. And Bernstein interpreted this to relate to the rebirth of the Jewish state. He said this isn't something that we're implying from him performing it there. It's actually something that he dedicated these performances to. And a really cool thing that the Philharmonic Archives has is actually a score, Leonard Bernstein's score of Mahler's Second. At the very end of it, there's a page, this is the fifth document, that is a Hebrew translation of one of the pages of the score, because the fifth movement of that symphony has voices. And so it was actually performed in Hebrew. So there's that connection. And I think we have to remember in the late 1960s, the Holocaust was still a fresh memory for a lot of people, including Bernstein. We talk about the Cold War, and I think we need to expand that context a little to include the fact that the Holocaust is not that long in the past. And Bernstein had actually just written an article about Mahler's music that claimed that this music predicted the tragedies of the 20th century, which for Bernstein included the Holocaust as well as the turbulence of the 60s. But he also wrote that Mahler's music had a sort of cleansing power. It represented emerging on the other side of a struggle, which connects to some of the things that Barbara said about music for a kind of peaceful purpose. So I think we can understand Bernstein's bringing Mahler to both Israel and Central Europe in the same tour in 1968, bringing Mahler's Fifth. In a sense, it's Bernstein using Mahler's music for a kind of therapeutic purpose on a global scale. And I think the fact that he had performed a movement from Mahler's Fifth at RFK's funeral suggests that it already had developed some of those connotations of therapy and cleansing and moving forward. And there was a point was mentioned a little bit earlier, just one last thing, that Bernstein had a real special connection to the Fifth, and that's true. I mean, someone else might know more about this, but I had recently read that Bernstein is actually buried with a copy of Mahler's Fifth Symphony. He had special connections to each of Mahler's symphonies, but that's a real connection. And I think we need to keep that in mind. This wasn't just performing any Mahler symphony. This was performing one that really seemed to carry a lot of meaning for him.
All right, thank you. Musicologist Matthew Mugmon, who is online with us from Harvard in Cambridge. All right, from Cambridge, we go to Tokyo now to talk to professor and composer Joe Kondo. Professor, to take a different turn on this, I can't say professor, that's everybody on this panel. Joe Kondo, you've expressed a particular interest in the significance of the New York Philharmonic Archives. And by the way, we've just been watching a fabulous demonstration of what anybody can do with the online archives in digging up those documents, going in close to them. It is a powerful online tool. Joe Kondo, what do you think about the significance of this whole Philharmonic Online Archives project?
Yes, I think the great significance of the New York Philharmonic Archive for musicological and sociological researchers will be, or has been pointed out in the discussion by the other participants. Therefore, I'd like to defocus my statement more on the general problems that today's orchestra is facing in the current cultural economic situations, and the possible way to shed light on the future of the orchestra in relation to the very idea of the archive. Bernstein with New York Philharmonic visited Japan in 1961, and I was a bit too young to experience the impact directly because I was in junior high school at that time. But watching the Bernstein's TV programs in the archive out of the New York Sales 1961 Japan tour, I realized that how amazingly the cultural atmosphere has changed in these 5 decades. The early 60s was certainly an age before the cultural globalization, and the public seemed conscious about the sharp cultural difference between the East and West. And it seems to me that the TV programs were made with the idea of East meets West and the other way around. The Bernstein or Western musician, so as the American audience of the film, encountering the traditional court music and contemporary music of Japan, while the Japanese public shown in the film being deeply impressed by the summit works of the Western art music performed by one of the most eminent orchestras visiting from the West. I'd like to say West rather than America, because in this context, the Japanese public took the New York Philharmonic as a representative of the Western musicians rather than simply American. And it looks as if the TV programs were all about enlightening the public of both sides, American and Japanese, regarding the art music developed in the 2 different traditions. The programs were supported by a strong convictions, it seems to me, that the art music is the one which holds that the highest value among the various categories of music, and therefore it is the mission of the cultural institution, such as orchestra or radio station, to enlighten the public, to make them appreciate and understand it. No doubt, I think I would say, the entire activity of getting more audience activity, which Bernstein conducted, was based solidly on this belief. But however, the cultural atmosphere of our age is very different from that. We see the relativism prompted by cultural globalization and commercialism prevailing in the world today. And in this cultural climate, the art music cannot claim anymore its supreme value over other kinds of musics. In other words, the high culture and the classical art music as its symbol has been degraded, and therefore no more being a sole object of public enlightenment. The art music now is nothing more than one of the items in the commercial catalog of music. It becomes a genuine commodity. Since the commercial items since the commercial market naturally promotes the items that sell better, that is popular kind of music rather than art music, serious music becomes suffering from the shortage of financial basis. That is exactly what is happening in the world of orchestra today, I think. And many orchestras all over the world are confronting to financial crisis, and some of them, in fact, quite a few of them, have already been disbanded for this reason. I would like to ask if there is any way that the orchestra can survive. I am one of the composers who believe a high value, if not absolutely the highest, of the classical art music and its contemporary ramifications. And I concerned what can be the role of the orchestra today in promoting the serious music which makes the orchestra itself survive. My own image of the future orchestra is the museum of music, though it sounds very redundant because the museum, the word museum itself already the house of muse. But the orchestra not just being a mere performing organization, but a museum of music. In fact, a large portion of the orchestral repertoire consists of the music of the past, in this case, the very near past included. But not just the performing repertoire, but also historical documents in the archive must serve well as essential material in building the museum of music. And once we get the idea of the orchestra as a museum, it should be not so difficult to define its cultural role and its organized activities. To some extent, in a similar direction taken by art museums today. The museums which display the heritage of mankind That's what draws common attention today, public, it seems to me. I think this idea should not sound too odd for the large performing organizations such as the New York Philharmonic and the Metropolitan Opera are already symbols of the New York City and its culture. Just as the Metropolitan Museum or Museum of Modern Art being regarded so. And I think the opening the archive of the orchestra would be a good starting step for the way to the Museum of Music, which makes the orchestra survive.
All right, thank you. Professor Joe Kondo speaking to us from Tokyo. Barbara Haws, archivist of the New York Philharmonic, we had some images, I think, associated with the East meets West ideas that Joe Kondo was speaking of. Do we want to deal with those images now? Are we ready for that?
You want to just show a couple? There's, I think, two that we put up, and then we...
Let's bring those up, and you can talk about them.
Oh, it's... No.
We'll dig around and find.
Let's move on to Shamus.
Right.
No, let's move on to Shamus.
All right, very well. Okay. All right, next in our queue of musical experts from around the world is somebody who comes actually from a slightly different perspective, and that is Shamus Khan. He's an assistant professor of sociology at Columbia, speaking to us actually now from Paris. Shamus Khan, from the perspective of the social scientist, what can we learn from the New York Philharmonic archives? What do they offer your field of study?
First, thanks for having me. It's kind of a pleasure to be here, and I'm learning a lot from the fellow panelists, so it's kind of a joy to be a part of this. From my experience in working with these archives and working with the New York Philharmonic, I mean, we get, particularly in the archives that are being released right now, from the 40s to the 70s, a picture of an American moment that's quite different, say, than the earlier periods of the Philharmonic. And one of the ways I think about this is to think about how America relates to culture, or a global culture more broadly. And if we think of earlier moments in the Philharmonic or earlier moments in cultural history of the United States, we often kind of get a view of Americans as not really having a culture. What we had is a lot of money, and we tended to buy culture or bring it in. Our museums were filled with European artifacts and artifacts from around the world. And when we needed to hire musicians or conductors or things like that, we brought them in from Europe. Similarly, when we wanted to play some kind of music that represented our cultural capacity, we primarily looked to Western Europe for a long period of time. But what happens after 43 is that you have this ascent of the United States, and a kind of hopeful ascent of the United States. And what we see in this archive is a kind of a chronicling of this. So it's not just that America brings military power at the end of the Second World War, or that it brings a kind of organization to the ways in which economies might work and be really successful. What we see the Philharmonic doing is claiming that there's something more to the American project, something deeper to the American project, where we actually can bring an American, a distinctly American culture to the rest of the world. And these tours represent this to a degree, both with the playing of American music, with the composition of the orchestra itself that looks slightly different than other orchestras, as you know, it's the 1960s, I believe, when the first African-American member of the Philharmonic plays. Is there women in the orchestra? It's a pointing to America as inheriting a Western tradition, but changing it into something quite different that might serve as a model for the world, and a kind of cultural model for the world, not just an economic or a military one. And you could read this as arrogance, but I think you could also read it as maybe the source of hope coming out of the Second World War.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Shamus Khan. And by the way, we can tell you're in Paris because of that exquisite flower arrangement that's over your left shoulder beautiful. There. You could be nowhere else in the world except in Paris, speaking to us today. I should remind those of you who are watching this live video hangout, as they call it on Google, that you can tweet questions to us using the hashtag the hashtag NYPhilHistory. Do I have that right? NYP history, sorry, NYP history. We do have a couple of questions to address to our panel in a few minutes, but we have one more person to talk to on this panel before that, and that is Mike Beckerman, who is here in New York. He's the chair of the music department at NYU. Mike Beckerman, we've talked about the New York Philharmonic archives and the material in them that relates to the tours that they took. We've talked about the reception of the Philharmonic behind the Iron Curtain in Russia and in Germany. We've talked about the influence that Bernstein had in bringing Mahler to a lot of places around the world, back home to Vienna, to Israel, and to other places. And we've talked now about the place of the Philharmonic in a sort of a larger cultural influence, and also how the Philharmonic on tour, and especially televised programs of the Philharmonic, were a representation not just of American music, but of Western music entirely in Japan. But what about all of this Bernstein Philharmonic material and its influence on American culture and its place in American culture at this time?
Well, I think he became a kind of symbolic force, a kind of musical JFK, in terms of this combination of hopeful optimism on the one hand and forging connections on the other. So, I mean, look at Lenny and the connections he made. He made, powerful generation building connections with audiences. So many people who I speak to now grew up with these young people's concerts, with the idea of speaking to an audience. I don't want to make too much of a contrast of it, but at one point after Boulez took over, they decided to have something called the rug concerts, where they removed all the seats and everybody was sitting on the rugs to make them feel comfortable. And there were questions, and I remember there was some concert of, I think it was Handel's Water Music, and somebody questioned the tempo, and Boulez sort of yelled at him, what are you questioning that tempo for? I mean, Lenny's approach was to really invite everybody in and to make these connections with people. But it wasn't only connections with people, it was connections with countries, it was connections of repertories, it was connections of styles and genres, it was bringing together his own capacity as conductor, performer, composer, but in many different styles and types, bringing jazz into the mainstream. So these kinds of connections, and we've just heard about them from our panelists. We've heard about the kinds of things he was doing in the Soviet Union. With the audacity, I mean, whether you call it bullshitting or not, it almost doesn't matter. The audacity to be bringing to the Soviet Union a passage from Billy the Kid and the Shostakovich Seventh. These Berlin concerts with this atmosphere of cultural exchange, coming to Israel and Central Europe, trying to connect up the Cold War and the Holocaust, both the Jewish and the non-Jewish worlds. We might also note, I did mention bullshitter, and I think it's important because one of the huge differences between Lenny and Gussie, you know who Gussie is, right? Gustav Mahler. No, Gustav Mahler was never known as Gussie. For all the similarities between the two figures, the one was a very serious, difficult, disciplinarian, buttoned-up guy, and Bernstein, for all the similarities, was somebody who loved to be informal, to reach out, to talk to people on an even level, and that sort of fit in with, whether you believe it or not, an American notion of democratizing, of trying to dismiss and downplay traditions of race and class, and even if in a way it's soft-pedaled or ignored some of the real differences between peoples and systems, it was a powerful force. So we had the idea of East meets West, which you could think of as a a parody, but at the same time it had powerful symbolic force. And what Shamus was just talking about, this idea of the hopeful ascent of the United States and America with a tradition of inclusiveness. And the Chronicle itself, I think, is in itself a model of inclusiveness. I mean, what is a Chronicle? A chronicle is an untheorized, and maybe in some ways you might argue untheorizable, a collection of materials, but out of which one can try to build different kinds of histories and approaches which are made richer by this chronicle. So just, you know, going through it and seeing the images of Shostakovich, or seeing the concert where these two works by Shostakovich and Copland are put together. But there's other things as well. You can look at the guest list for Bruno Walter's 80th birthday and see the names of Myra Hess and Vladimir Horowitz, Fritz Kreisler, David Rockefeller, Henry Steinway, and Arturo Toscanini. You can read about conflicts, which nobody's trying to downplay. When Volpe's symphony was performed and there was a huge battle between the orchestra and Michael Steinberg. So the richness of these archives is kind of a larger metaphor for the very kinds of connections that Lenny was making throughout his career, and that are so vital for trying to understand, of course, not only that period, but our period as well.
Thank you, Mike Beckerman. That's a great way to contextualize these archives for people who would like to come in from the outside and take a look at them. This is very much a part of the New York Philharmonic's project, is to present to the public the archives of the New York Philharmonic in a way they can access online. It has so many advantages. You don't have to travel to New York to look at the documents. The documents themselves aren't necessarily damaged by overhandling, and it really is a democratic thing. Anybody can go and look at them. We've had a couple of questions that have come into us, and Barbara Haws, archivist and historian of the Philharmonic, I think this probably goes to you. What items or materials exist in the archives to show how the New York Philharmonic was received in the countries they visited on these tours? The question comes from Eric Gewurtz. So how would we find these? Are we able to see any concert reviews or ways that the orchestra was perceived when it made these foreign tours?
The concert reviews are in the next phase. we still have all of the scrapbooks and all of the reviews from around the world yet to put up. It takes a whole different kind of workflow or process to get those done, but they will be there. And we don't have these in the garage, but we do have enormous files of complaint letters. If you'd like to see, I mean, the Philharmonic never threw anything away. And so we do have remarkable folders of complaints about performing new music in the late 50s, or Lenny's conducting style, or even the fact that we're allowing, you know, communist supporters of on our intermission features. They really are capturing a particular thought and idea or personality at a certain time.
I can't believe the Philharmonic still doesn't get complaint letters about Lenny's conducting style and programming new music. I have to believe that still happens even now. Maybe this is a question for some of our other panelists, particularly Professor Rathert, Wolfgang Rathert, and for Olga Manulkina. We have a question that came in on Twitter from Will Robin. To what degree did Cold War politics influence the programming decisions of the New York Philharmonic in the 50s and 60s on their international tours? I'm not sure if who on the panel could speak to that, and maybe Barbara, you even should lead that off.
Well, I find every time I've talked with Olga or Wolfgang, I learn something new about what I thought I knew everything about. So in particular, with these photographs that we have now up, I don't know if Mitch can put up one from Olga's in the photographs from backstage in Moscow. I mean, we can get into the Cold War thing, but it's more of an example of what I think is fascinating about having this available and having people from other places look at these. In particular, in this photograph, Olga, if you can see this one, you know, for instance, we know who all the Americans are, and we know who Shostakovich is, but we don't know who the Russians are. And the other day, Olga showed us, you know, that this was, Olga, can you see this photograph?
Yes, sure. The tall man at the opposite side of the table is Dmitry Kabalevsky. He's a very prominent musician and official. So, but others still should be recognized, and that's the work for us together, I think.
You thought one of the gentlemen there might be your father's music teacher. Do you still think that's the case, or does that take a little more research to figure that one out?
I was young at that moment, so I will discuss it with my colleague, probably it's another
I
person.
mean, to me, that's just magic to all of a sudden be able to find that. But that's not addressing your specific question. I'm just thrilled to have that. But so maybe Olga or Wolfgang have some thoughts on the programming and how that might have.
Yeah. Yes. I feel that all the Russian and American music in the programs was inspired of this situation. And to Stravinsky, I should add Charles Ives, of course. That was kind of discovery of America for the listeners. And again, it was a shock that Bernstein spoke about accidental combination of the themes in this music, which this word itself was like breaking the foundations of the state, of the regime. And playing Shostakovich, of course, as the main figure, and playing his Fifth Symphony was the gesture, and bringing Leonard Pasternak from Peredelkina to this concert for the first time after his exile was the clear gesture that against this Cold War situation, and trying to bring people to make connections between Russians and Americans.
Thank you, Olga. Wolfgang, do you have any thoughts on this about what influence the politics of the day would have had on particular programming? I mean, we've talked about it a little bit, but is there more?
I don't know the extent of the State Department's decisions or strategies in suggesting programs for American orchestras going abroad and going west, or going east, going east. And I guess in a way it's a kind of shop window to demonstrate the abilities, the capacities of American orchestras and of American composers. And on the other hand, I don't know if I'm wrong, but I think that with Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, there's a special story because it had been bootlegged in 1943, the microfilms to the United States, from Leningrad. And it was at its first performance in the United States under, oh my dear,
Toscanini,
I guess, yeah. And so this was a piece with a special importance and meaning. And then there was the other story that Shostakovich had been invited by the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which gave a congress in New York at Waldorf Astoria, which was highly discussed and controversial. And so I think that Bernstein, when he performed the Seventh Symphony in Russia, that was a special reaction and a special commentary on this Cold War conflicts around music, around these pieces.
Right, but am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, but the thing is that he was sincere. You know, I mean, if it had seemed to people at the time or seemed to us now that somehow it was a setup and it was an insincere attempt to kind of create American cultural supremacy, I think we would back off from it. But even in hindsight, despite all the political aspects, there's an atmosphere of genuine sincerity there. And if I can just for a second think about a much earlier moment with the New York Philharmonic that I'm perhaps even more familiar with, it's the premiere of the New World Symphony in 1893, where you have a European-born composer and a European conductor trying to create an ideal of what American music might someday become, and then to fast forward to a time where you've got an American-born conductor presenting American works, some of which, in the case of Ives, have already acquired a kind of classic status.
Yes.
It shows a kind of coming of age that is probably both valuable in a Cold War sense to establish American cultural politics, but in a much broader sense to show a kind of artistic coming of age.
Of course, I completely agree, Mike, and all this had also a story before. We know that Stronimsky had conducted Ives around 1930, so Bernstein was on the footsteps of conductors who had done this before, and that is, of course, as I see it, you can see through the archive the emancipation of American music and of American culture as a cultural contribution to 20th century music and culture, and not as a political.
All right, thank you, Michael Beckerman and Wolfgang Rathert. We have another question for those of you in the East and the Far West, I guess. The tours of the New York Philharmonic in the 50s and 60s carried a clear political message. That much we know, given the proximity to World War II and the fact that they were performing behind the Iron Curtain at that time. But since the world has changed, does that political message is it still carried today, or is there a different political message carried when the New York Philharmonic comes to places that were once behind the Iron Curtain, or when the New York Philharmonic tours Japan? What's the political message then? Any of you?
Well, I think even in the 60s, Japanese audience didn't take the New York Philharmonic visit as any political act. And probably that was intended. You know, it's a sort of a concealed political intention behind that artistic presentation. But then after that, it seems that the American politics regarding music turned into the avant-garde music rather than classical music. And the late 60s, the CIA brought the then American fashionable avant-garde music to Japan, which had a huge impact to the Japanese avant-garde music world. But now, as I said, the Japanese Western music goer is just looking at the Europe rather than America, I'm afraid to say. So the American orchestra visiting Japan is simply regarded as sort of one of the Western orchestra, no any political implication in it. So that's the typical reaction of the Japanese today, I think.
All right, thank you, Joe Kondo. Any of our other panelists have thoughts on that? Olga, Wolfgang?
I would love to hear New York Philharmonic here, but unfortunately, we didn't have chance to check what they will be connotations and references. And Bernstein came only once again to the Soviet Union in 1988, not with New York Philharmonic, and it was again the central event of the first years of Perestroika. Of course, it wasn't such a thing as in 1959, but it was again the starting of the new era when it will be possible to see and hear the orchestras and conductors more and more in the new atmosphere.
Jeff, if
yes.
If we could put up a couple of the photographs from Japan, in particular in following up on Professor Kondo's suggestion, this is a way of East meeting West or West meeting East. There are a couple of striking ones. One with Leonard Bernstein and the Imperial Court Musicians.
That's up there now.
That's up there now. I think actually that some of these, what he was doing was actually more for the Americans back home, of showing in the 1960s. That, I mean, in particular in this photograph where, you know, usually you have these very serious, somewhat severe court musicians, and they're actually very, he's having a very fun moment with them. So this is one, and then you go to the next one. And this is, of course, they took along Seiji Ozawa on this tour. He was an assistant conductor at the time in the Philharmonic, and he conducted works. And of course, they had a baseball game. So this was these two photographs, I think, very much bring together the East and the West out of all the photographs that we have in the archive.
All right, thank you, Barbara. We've reached the end of our hour. We have one more question, but Barbara, I don't know about people's time schedules. I don't know if we need to end. Do people need to stop hanging out, or should we take this last question? What do you think?
Well, that's a difficult thing. And okay, is there a quick answer, you think?
Maybe everybody can come up with a quick answer to this question.
Okay.
The question is, what's been the most exciting discovery that you found in the digital archives of the Philharmonic? We've seen some remarkable photographs already. That Hebrew translated Mahler in that Mahler Symphony, a fascinating document that is. Have any of the other scholars here on this hangout discovered something that really made their eyes go wide open in amazement at something in the Philharmonic archives? No would only mean that you haven't looked at everything yet, so it's okay. There's no pressure. Wolfgang.
Of course, but I haven't had enough time to go through the scores. I think that's for me, one of the most revealing and fascinating issues of the archive, to see the scores on detail, and to see that there are scores that had used by Mahler, by Bruno Walter, and then by Bernstein. So you have three layers of musical geniuses working with the scores, and that's a wonderful and ever fascinating revelation for me.
Maybe I could add one. Just the administrative documents. Some of the that you hear that word and you think, oh, this must be boring. But actually, it's really amazing to see some of the discussions that are happening behind the scenes. Just looking at programming and what people in different levels of the orchestra hierarchy are saying about what kind of music they think should be played and how that is negotiated by the conductors who are making the decisions about what they want to play. So there's this huge wealth of information about the politics behind programming that are in these administrative documents that are really fascinating.
I would second Matt on that. I mean, it's kind of amazing also to see the fights. I mean, they're sometimes contentious, and for a researcher, it's wonderful that the Philharmonic sort of, I wouldn't say they're airing their dirty laundry, but at least making clear some of the more contentious debates of the board at the time and of all kinds of members. It's really exciting to see.
Barbara, maybe we could look at the end to Mahler's Fifth Symphony, to the it's ID 2176, and Bernstein's remarks, because I think that would be a good closing point for our discussion, and it's a wonderful and for me moving document. ID 2176. It was on page. On one of the first pages.
I'm sure Mitch is working on getting that up.
Yeah, we're going to get that up in just a moment.
And while I just would like to thank all of the participants for agreeing to be a part of this. It's been just a treat to work with you all over the last few weeks and to get to know you. And although one of you said, well, we should do this more often. At that time, we were a little bit busy with trying to get just one of these done, but I think that's a great idea. And I think it'd be just, it actually is, once you've learned how to do it, fairly easy to do. Jeff, it's been fabulous to have you here moderating for us and keeping us all kind of on time. I really appreciate that. And then I'd just like to say thank you to the extraordinary team that has put all of the digital archives together, from Mitch Brodsky, who's there behind the scenes, who's also our digital archives manager, to Ardon Barhama, who's in Israel, and who's our photographer beyond excellence, who gets all of these things to look as beautiful as you see and to have more of that available to you. To the Leon Levy's also for their extraordinary support, and then to the great team of archivists if you think archives are quiet, you should come really visit us on site sometime, because it is a very lively place where a lot of people are sharing ideas. And I hope you all go to we have a Facebook page where new documents or favorite documents of the team are posted every day, and it brings to light a lot of things that I never even knew existed. So it's been such a path of discovery that I can't tell you how much it means to me to have everybody here. Thank you.
Wolfgang, can you tell us a little bit about this document that you were mentioning?
No, I just found it's on the page before. Maybe
I can't see it, but I don't know. Can everybody else see it?
Mike, click down in the bottom. You can pull it up.
So I couldn't read every word, but at the end he says it's a program. It's his own interpretation of Mahler's Fifth Symphony, where he speaks of sublimations of rage and of anger, bitter sorrow, and about that's what impressed me most. The second movement, he says, it ends with teeth still clenched, despite occasional hints of ultimate glory and salvation. And to the third movement, to hell with it, let's get drunk.
To hell with it.
Right.
Well, and on that note, then, I guess.
Sounds like a great way to end.
It does indeed. It does indeed. Listen, this has been a fascinating hour with great scholarship and an amazing experience of connection all around the world. It's what happens in music, and technology is in a way behind the human heart in experiencing all of these things. But we're doing the best we can with this Google Hangout. And so once again, thanks to all of our participants: Michael Beckerman, the chair of music at NYU; Matthew Mugmon, musicologist in Cambridge; Shamus Khan, assistant professor of sociology at Columbia in Paris; Wolfgang Rathert in Berlin, musicology professor at the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich; Olga Manulkina, associate professor of the St. Petersburg State Conservatory in St. Petersburg; and Joe Kondo, composer and professor of music at the Ochanomizu University in Tokyo; and of course Barbara Haws, archivist and historian of the New York Philharmonic. Thanks to everyone who participated, everyone who was here watching. Go to the New York Philharmonic online archives and discover a whole world of magic. I'm Jeff Spurgeon from WQXR. Thank you one and all for your participation.